Wyoming Territory, 1873. The silence was a physical thing, a weight that settled over the land as heavy as a winter snow. Caleb Thorne knew its every texture, its every subtle shift. He knew the silence of deep night, when the coyotes' calls only seemed to emphasize the emptiness. He knew the silence of noon, when the sun bleached all sound from the air, leaving only the drone of insects and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. 4 or 5 years, this silence had been his only constant companion, a fortress he had built around himself, stone by painful stone. From the porch of his modest ranch house, he watched the world with the detached calm of a man who expected nothing from it. The mountains, a jagged purple line against the horizon, were his boundary stones. The vast, unending sky was his ceiling. This small piece of Wyoming, carved out with sweat and loss, was his entire kingdom. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood of the porch rail, his knuckles scarred and calloused. The land was an honest adversary. It demanded everything: strength, vigilance, patience, but it never lied. It did not promise happiness only to snatch it away in the dead of night, leaving behind nothing but a hollow echo. People did that. Love did that. He had learned that lesson with a finality that had scoured him clean of hope. The memories of Sarah and little Lily were locked away in a part of his mind he never visited, a shuttered room filled with the scent of lavender and the ghost of a child's laughter. To remember was to invite the pain back in, and his fortress of solitude was built specifically to keep it out. Survival, he had long ago decided, was a solitary endeavor. Attachments were anchors that could drag a man down into depths from which there was no return. His gaze drifted east, toward the thin iron rails that sliced through the prairie, a man-made scar on the otherwise perfect desolation. The noon train was due. He knew its schedule not because he anticipated its arrival, but because it was part of the unchanging rhythm of his life, like sunrise and sunset. Its distant whistle was a punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of his day. Usually, he heard it, registered it, and went back to mending a fence or checking on his herd. But today, a strange restlessness stirred in him. It was a faint, unfamiliar current in the still waters of his existence. He told himself it was the heat, the way it shimmered off the dusty ground, making the world seem unreal, like a dream from which he might soon wake. Then he heard it, a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. The train. A plume of dark smoke smudged the pristine blue of the sky, growing steadily larger. It was a disruption, a noisy, clattering intrusion from another world, a world of cities and crowds and complications he had left behind. He watched it pull into the small, dusty station of Redemption Gulch, a town that was little more than a single street clinging precariously to the edge of nowhere. He had no reason to go into town, no supplies to fetch, no business to conduct. Yet, he found himself reaching for his hat, his muscles moving with a will of their own. A feeling he could not name, a premonition as subtle as a shift in the wind, pulled him from the sanctuary of his porch. He saddled his horse, the familiar creak of leather a comforting sound, and rode toward the distant cloud of steam, toward the disruption he felt an inexplicable urge to witness firsthand. The dust his horse kicked up swirled behind him like golden phantoms, ghosts of a life he thought he had buried for good. Eleanora Ainsworth stepped down from the stifling heat of the passenger car, her gloved hand gripping the iron railing as if it were the last solid thing in a tilting world. The journey from Boston had been a long, jarring ordeal of soot and cinders, of landscapes that grew progressively wilder and more alien with each passing day. Now, standing on the rough wooden platform of Redemption Gulch, she felt as though she had stepped onto another planet entirely. The air was thin and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something wild and faintly sweet, like pine and sun-baked earth. The silence that Caleb Thorne knew as peace, she experienced as a profound and unnerving emptiness. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a deep blue serge that had seemed practical in the East, but felt impossibly heavy and dark under the vast, oppressive sky. Her honey-blonde hair was coiled neatly beneath a modest hat, but she could feel stray tendrils escaping, clinging to the perspiration on her neck. She scanned the small cluster of people on the platform. A few weathered-looking men in dusty hats, a woman with two small children clinging to her skirts. She was looking for Mr. Elias Vance. The name felt strange on her tongue, the name of the man she had never met, the man who was to be her husband. The arrangement had been made by Mr. Silas Croft, her late father's business partner, who had assured her it was a respectable match, a chance for a new beginning after the grief and uncertainty that had followed her father's sudden death. But as the train hissed and groaned behind her, preparing for its departure, and the small crowd began to disperse, a cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. There was no one who looked like they were waiting for a bride from the east. There was no friendly face, no sign with her name on it. There was only the indifferent stare of the sun and the vast, empty land stretching out in all directions. The train gave a final, shuddering lurch and began to pull away, its whistle a lonely cry that echoed her own sense of abandonment. She was alone, utterly and completely alone in a place that felt like the end of the world. Caleb had tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store and was watching from the shadows of its awning. He had seen her the moment she stepped off the train. She was a splash of color in a world of brown and gray, as out of place as a porcelain teacup in a blacksmith shop. He noted the fine cut of her dress, the way she held herself with a straight-backed dignity that seemed at war with the vulnerability in her eyes. He saw the initial hope on her face curdle into confusion, then into a quiet, rising panic. He had seen that look before, on the faces of greenhorns who had been sold a dream of the West that bore no resemblance to the harsh reality. He felt a familiar, unwelcome pang of sympathy. It was a weakness, he reminded himself, a chink in his armor. He watched as she approached the station master, old Jed, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles. Caleb was too far away to hear their words, but he could read the story in their gestures. He saw Eleonora's hands twist the handle of her reticule, saw Jed shake his head slowly, his expression a mixture of pity and regret. The story was always the same, a false promise, a ticket to nowhere. As Jed turned and went back inside his office, leaving her standing alone on the empty platform, Caleb saw her shoulders slump, a barely perceptible surrender to the crushing weight of her predicament. Just then, a sudden gust of wind, a common and capricious trick of the high plains, swept through the dusty street. It caught her hat, threatening to send it tumbling, and she reached up to secure it. In that moment of distraction, the wind also caught her large valise, tipping it from its precarious perch on the edge of the platform. It fell with a dull thud, the latch springing open. Its contents, a few carefully folded dresses, a book of poetry, a silver-backed brush, and a scattering of letters, spilled out into the thick, red dust. Something in the sight of her personal, private things laid bare in the dirt broke through Caleb's carefully constructed detachment. He moved before he had even made a conscious decision to do so. He crossed the street in long, purposeful strides, his boots sinking into the dust that swirled around his ankles. She was kneeling, frantically trying to gather her belongings, her movements clumsy with distress. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, startled, and he saw her eyes for the first time. They were the color of a summer sky, just before a storm, a deep, troubled blue. "Allow me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the most he had said to a stranger in months. He began to help her, his large, calloused hands gently brushing the dust from a book of sonnets before placing it back in her valise. As she reached for a stray ribbon, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that was entirely unexpected. It was a feeling he had not experienced in 5 years, a flicker of life in a part of him he had thought long dead. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks. The air between them crackled with a sudden, unspoken intimacy, an awareness that was as potent as it was unnerving. In that moment, A woman he did not know had breached his fortress without even trying, and the realization left him feeling dangerously exposed. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. She avoided his eyes, focusing on closing the latch of the now dirty valise. Caleb stood, offering her a hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her gloved fingers in his. Her hand felt small and delicate in his grasp, yet he could feel a surprising strength in it. He pulled her to her feet, their proximity creating a bubble of shared space in the vast emptiness of the street. He could smell a faint scent of lavender clinging to her clothes, a fragrance that painfully reminded him of the life he had lost. The memory was a sharp, unexpected jab, and he immediately hardened his expression, retreating behind his usual mask of stoicism. "You were meeting someone?" he asked, his tone more curt than he intended. She flinched at his abruptness, but answered with a quiet dignity. "A Mr. Elias Vance. I was told he would be here." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had known it. "There is no Elias Vance in Redemption Gulch," he stated flatly. "Never has been." He saw the last flicker of hope die in her eyes, leaving them shadowed with a profound weariness. He felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the faceless man who had done this, who had lured this woman across a continent with a lie and left her stranded. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked around at the dusty street, at the unforgiving landscape that stretched to the horizon. She looked utterly lost. A ship without a harbor, and the protective instinct he had been fighting against rose up, fierce and undeniable. He was a man who had sworn off attachments, who believed in solitude as the only true form of safety. But to turn his back on her, to leave her to the mercy of this harsh land and the few, not always reputable men who inhabited it, was something his own code of honor would not permit. He was trapped, caught between the fortress he had built around his heart and the man he used to be, the man who would not stand by and watch someone suffer. Sheriff Brody's office was small and smelled of stale coffee, leather, and the cheap tobacco he chewed. He was a man whose face had been weathered by decades of sun and trouble, but his eyes were shrewd and kind. He listened patiently as Eleonora, prompted by Caleb's terse explanation, recounted her story. She spoke with a composure that Caleb found remarkable, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands. When she had finished, the sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Silas Croft, you say? The name sounds familiar. Some big-shot investor from back east, buying up land claims, sight unseen. Sounds like he wanted you out of the way for some reason. As for this Vance fellow, Caleb is right. He's a ghost. A fabrication to get you on that train." Eleonora absorbed this confirmation of her abandonment with a quiet grace that pricked at Caleb's conscience. "What am I to do?" she asked, her gaze directed at the sheriff, but her question hanging in the air for both of them. "My funds are limited. I cannot afford passage back to Boston, and even if I could, I have nothing and no one to return to." The sheriff stroked his graying beard, his eyes moving from Eleanor's pale, determined face to Caleb's grim, unreadable one. He knew Caleb Thorne better than most. He knew about Sarah and Lily. He had watched his friend retreat from the world, turning his ranch into an island of grief. Brody saw an opportunity, a chance to throw a lifeline to two drowning souls at once. "Well, the boarding house here ain't no place for a lady like yourself," the sheriff said slowly. "Rough crowd, but Thorne here has a big house. And a housekeeper, Martha, a formidable woman. You be safe there, just until we can figure something out. It wouldn't be proper otherwise, of course, but Martha's presence makes it decent." Caleb's head snapped up. He shot the sheriff a look of pure betrayal. His home was his sanctuary, the one place the outside world could not touch. The thought of bringing this woman, this stranger who had already unsettled him more than anyone had in years, into that space was unthinkable. "Brody, that's not. It's the only sensible option, Caleb," the sheriff cut in, his tone firm. "You know it is. Unless you want to see her sleeping in my jail cell for her own protection." He turned back to Eleonora. "Caleb's a good man, miss. You be safe with him and Martha." Eleonora looked at Caleb, her blue eyes searching his face. He could see the conflict in them, the desperation of her situation warring with the pride that would not let her beg. He felt cornered. The sheriff had invoked his honor, a cage from which he could not escape. To refuse would be an act of cruelty, a violation of the very principles his father had instilled in him. He gave a short, sharp nod, the movement stiff with reluctance. For a few days, he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth, until he can find passage or employment. A wave of relief washed over Eleanora's face, so profound that it made his chest ache. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft. "I would be in your debt." He didn't want her debt. He didn't want her gratitude. He wanted her to be 1,000 miles away, back in the world she came from, so he could retreat into the familiar, painless silence of his own. But it was too late. He had helped her pick up her belongings from the dust, and in doing so, had inadvertently picked up a responsibility he did not want. The ride back to his ranch was conducted in a taut silence, the space between them filled with unspoken thoughts. She rode his spare mare with a surprising confidence, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the imposing mountains ahead. Caleb rode beside her, acutely aware of her presence, of the faint scent of lavender that the wind carried to him, a ghost of a scent that threatened to unlock the most heavily barred door in his heart. Martha, Caleb's housekeeper, was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with hands that could knead bread, soothe a feverish child, or wield a shotgun with equal competence. She had been with Caleb's family since before he was born and had stayed on after the tragedy, a silent, unmovable pillar of support in the ruins of his life. When Caleb arrived with Eleanora in tow, Martha's eyes, as sharp and observant as a hawk's, took in the entire situation in a single glance. The fine but travel-worn dress, the exhaustion in the young woman's face, and the thunderous, reluctant expression on Caleb's. "We have a guest, Martha," Caleb announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "This is Miss Ainsworth. She'll be staying for a short while." Martha simply nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Eleanora. "Welcome, child. You look weary to the bone. Come inside. I'll fetch you some cool water and prepare a room." She ushered Eleanora into the house with a warmth that Caleb himself was incapable of showing, leaving him standing on the porch, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He heard their voices from inside, Martha's low and comforting, Eleanora's soft and grateful. The sound of female voices in his house, a sound that had been absent for 5 long years, was like a melody both beautiful and excruciating to hear. That evening, they sat down to dinner in the large, quiet kitchen. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The meal, a simple but hearty beef stew prepared by Martha, was eaten mostly in silence. Caleb felt Eleanora's eyes on him occasionally, but he kept his own gaze fixed on his plate. The silence was different now. It was no longer the peaceful, empty silence of his solitude. It was a tense, charged silence, filled with questions and the heavy weight of their shared circumstances. After Martha had cleared the plates and tactfully retired to her own quarters, leaving them alone, Eleanora finally spoke. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her hands clasped in her lap, "I cannot properly express my gratitude. You have shown me a kindness I did not expect." "It was nothing," he said, his voice clipped. He wanted to end the conversation, to retreat to the porch in the safety of the night. But she would not be so easily dismissed. "It was not nothing. It was everything," she insisted gently. "You and Sheriff Brody. You may have saved my life." She paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. "My father was a geologist. A good man, but a dreamer. He trusted people too easily. He trusted Silas Croft, his business partner. After my mother passed, it was just the two of us. When my father died, Mr. Croft was so helpful, so kind. He told me my father had left debts, that our home in Boston had to be sold. He said this marriage was my only prospect. A good man," he said, in a land of opportunity. A bitter smile touched her lips. "It seems he lied about everything." Her story was one of loss and betrayal, and despite himself, Caleb felt a stir of empathy. Her loneliness resonated with his own. A familiar chord struck in the darkness. He found himself speaking, the words coming out before he could stop them. The West is full of lies. It promises wealth to men who find only dust, and promises new beginnings to people who cannot escape their pasts. She looked at him, her blue eyes seeming to see right through his hardened exterior. "And what about you, Mr. Thorne? Did it give you the new beginning you were looking for?" The question was direct, personal, and it cut straight to the heart of the matter. He should have shut it down, told her it was none of her business. But something in her earnest, compassionate gaze disarmed him. He looked away from her, into the dancing flames. "I didn't come here for a new beginning," he said, his voice low and strained. "I came here to be left alone. I had a life before this. A wife, a daughter." He had not spoken those words aloud to anyone in 5 years. They felt foreign on his tongue, artifact from another man's life. Saying them now, to this woman, felt like a betrayal of his grief, yet also, terrifyingly, like a release. Eleonora's expression softened with a deep, genuine sympathy. She did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply sat with him in the shared knowledge of loss, her quiet presence a balm he had not realized he needed. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words filled with an understanding that went beyond mere politeness. In that moment, by the flickering firelight in the quiet heart of his isolated home, the first true bond between them was formed. It was a fragile connection, forged in the dark soil of shared sorrow and vulnerability, but it was real. And for Caleb, it was the most dangerous thing in the world. The next few days settled into an unexpected routine. Eleonora, refusing to be an idle guest, insisted on helping Martha. To Caleb's surprise, she was a quick learner. Though her hands were soft and unaccustomed to labor, she tackled every task with a quiet determination. He would see her in the vegetable garden, her fine dress protected by one of Martha's aprons, a smudge of dirt on her cheek as she carefully weeded around the beans. He heard her laughter, a light, musical sound, as she and Martha baked bread in the kitchen. She was bringing life and light into the shadowed corners of his house, and it both terrified and captivated him. He tried to maintain his distance, spending his days out on the range, working until his muscles ached and his mind was too tired to think. But he found his thoughts drifting back to the ranch, to her. He would catch himself wondering what she was doing, listening for the sound of her voice when he returned in the evening. He started to see his home through her eyes. He noticed the worn patch on the armchair by the fire, the way the evening sun slanted through the kitchen window, the simple beauty of the wildflower she had picked and placed in a jar on the mantel. She was showing him the world he had forgotten how to see. He began to see her, too. He saw past the refined lady from the East and saw the woman beneath. He saw her resilience, the unyielding core of strength that had allowed her to face abandonment and uncertainty without crumbling. He saw her intelligence in the evenings when she would read aloud from her book of poetry, her voice filling the quiet room with a beauty that made his heart ache. And she saw him. She saw the kindness he tried so hard to conceal beneath his gruff exterior. She saw the profound sadness that haunted his eyes, and she did not shy away from it. She saw the honorable man who had taken her in when he had every reason to turn away. A mutual respect grew between them, a silent acknowledgement of the character of the other. One afternoon, returning earlier than usual, he found her in the barn, attempting to groom his horse, Atlas. The big gelding was gentle, but Eleonora was clearly nervous, her movements hesitant. "You hold the brush too tight," he said, his voice making her jump. "You have to let it flow with the grain of the coat. Like this." He stepped behind her, his body close to hers, and placed his hand over hers on the brush. Her hand was warm, and he could feel the faint tremor running through it. He guided her hand, showing her the long, smooth strokes. He was acutely aware of the scent of her hair, of the delicate curve of her neck. The simple act of instruction became charged with an unspoken intimacy. He could feel her breath catch, her body grow still. He dropped his hand as if the brush had suddenly grown hot and stepped back, putting a safe distance between them. "He seems to like it," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Atlas is a good judge of character. Caleb replied, turning his attention to a piece of tack that didn't need fixing. The small, enclosed space of the barn seemed to shrink around them, amplifying the tension. He knew he should leave, should retreat to the open range where the air was clear and his thoughts were his own. But he found himself rooted to the spot, content for a moment just to be near her, to watch her gentle hands move over his horse. The walls of his fortress were beginning to crumble, and he didn't know if he had the strength, or even the will, to rebuild them. The fragile piece of their arrangement was shattered a week after Eleanor's arrival. Two strangers rode into Redemption Gulch. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They had the hard, watchful eyes of men who were paid to do unpleasant things. They tethered their horses outside the saloon and went inside, but their questions were not about whiskey or women. They were asking about a woman who had arrived on the noon train from the east, a woman with honey blonde hair and a blue dress. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Redemption Gulch. The barkeep, a man loyal to Sheriff Brody, sent his boy to fetch him. Brody listened to the description and his gut tightened. He rode out to the Thorn Ranch immediately. He found Caleb replacing a post on the corral fence, the rhythmic thud of his hammer, the only sound in the afternoon heat. "Caleb," Brody said, dismounting. "We have a problem. 2 men in town. Hired muscle by the look of them. Asking about Miss Ainsworth." Caleb stopped hammering, his body going rigid. The restlessness he had felt on the day of her arrival returned, this time as a cold, sharp-edged premonition of danger. He had known her predicament was not a simple case of a jilted bride. The name Silas Croft had stuck in his mind. Men like that did not act without reason. What do they want? They didn't say. But they're not here to wish her well, Brody said grimly. I think that fiancé story was more than just a way to get her out of Boston. Croft wants something she has. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He thought of her meager belongings, the contents of which he had seen spilled in the dust. A few dresses, a brush, some books. It made no sense, unless she possessed something without even knowing it. His gaze drifted toward the house, where he could see her through the window, sitting at the kitchen table, helping Martha shell peas. An image of her, so full of life and gentle grace, superimposed itself over the threat the sheriff described. A fierce, protective anger, cold and clean, surged through him. These men, this unknown danger, would not touch her. He would not allow it. "I'll be in town tomorrow for supplies," Caleb said to Martha the next morning, deliberately keeping his tone casual. "Miss Ainsworth, perhaps you'd like to accompany me. A change of scenery." He was lying. He needed to see these men for himself, to gauge the threat. But he also felt an undeniable need to keep her close, where he could protect her. Eleanora, weary of the confines of the ranch, agreed immediately, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of the outing. The ride into town was pleasant. She asked him about the names of the wildflowers that grew by the roadside, about the history of the land. He found himself answering more freely than he had in years, sharing stories his father had told him, pointing out a hawk circling high overhead. For a short time, he could almost forget the reason for their journey. But the moment they rode onto the main street of Redemption Gulch, the tension returned. He saw them immediately. The two men were lounging on the porch of the saloon, their hats pulled low. They watched everyone who passed with a predatory stillness. As Caleb helped Eleanor dismount in front of the general store, he saw their heads turn, their eyes fixed on her, a flicker of recognition and avarice in their gazes. They had found who they were looking for. Caleb positioned himself between Eleanora and the saloon, his hand resting casually on the Colt at his hip. "Wait for me in the store," he said, his voice low and firm. She looked from him to the men on the porch, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but she nodded and did as he asked. Caleb did not go into the store. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, across the dusty street toward the saloon. The two men watched him approach, their lounging postures tightening into something more wary. One of them, a burly man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, pushed himself off the porch post. "Something we can help you with, friend?" the man asked, his voice a low growl. "That depends," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. He stopped a few feet from the porch steps. "The lady you were staring at is under my protection. Your business here is finished. I suggest you ride out." The second man, leaner and with shifty eyes, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is that so? We have business with her. A private matter. It doesn't concern you." "You just made it my concern," Caleb said, his gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "This is your only warning. Leave Redemption Gulch. Now." The scar man took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "Or what?" Caleb didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held the man's gaze. "Or you'll be carried out," he said, the words delivered with a chilling certainty. In that moment, the quiet, solitary rancher was gone, replaced by a man who was utterly confident in his ability to inflict violence. The air crackled. The street fell silent. The two men looked at Caleb's cold, steady eyes, at the hand resting inches from his gun, and they saw a line they were not willing to cross. "Not yet." The scarred man grunted, a sound of frustration and reluctant concession. He gave his partner a look, and without another word, they turned, untied their horses, and rode out of town, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. Caleb watched them go, his body still coiled and ready. He knew it was not over. They were not scared, merely deterred. They would be back. He turned and saw Eleonora standing in the doorway of the general store, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had seen it all. She had seen the dangerous man who lived inside the quiet one, and he wondered if the sight of him had frightened her more than the two thugs had. The confrontation in town had changed things. The unspoken threat now had a face, and the fragile sense of peace at the ranch was replaced by a taut, watchful vigilance. Caleb found he could not let Eleonora out of his sight. He made excuses to keep her close, asking for her help with tasks near the house, positioning himself so he always had a clear view of the road. His protective instincts, once a flicker, had become a raging fire. The thought of those men laying a hand on her filled him with a cold fury he had not felt since the war. Eleonora, for her part, seemed to understand the shift. She did not question his constant presence, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The incident had stripped away any lingering illusions she might have had about her situation. She was not just a stranded woman. She was a hunted one. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, she finally voiced the question that lay between them. "They work for Silas Croft, don't they?" she asked, her voice quiet. Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Most likely, but what could they possibly want? I have nothing of value. My father's estate was negligible. Mr. Croft made that very clear. Men like that don't send hired guns after nothing," Caleb said. "Think, Eleonora. Did your father leave you anything? Anything at all, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed? A keepsake? A box of papers?" She shook her head, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Only his personal effects. His books, his clothes, and his old leather valise. The one that fell at the station." She looked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion. "It's just a worn old travel bag." But Caleb's mind seized on the detail. The valise. The one thing those men would have seen her with at the station. It had to be connected. "Where is it?" he asked. "In my room, under the bed," she replied. They went inside together. Eleonora pulled the scuffed leather bag out. It looked ordinary while used. Caleb took it from her, his hands running over the worn exterior, testing the weight, feeling the seams. He opened it and went through the contents again. Nothing. Just her dresses and a few personal items. He was about to dismiss the idea when his fingers caught on a subtle thickness in the bottom lining. It was almost imperceptible, a slight stiffness where the rest of the fabric was pliable. He took out his pocket knife and, with her permission, carefully slit the stitches of the lining. Inside, tucked between the layers of fabric, was a folded piece of oilcloth. He gently unfolded it on the bed. It was a map, hand-drawn with meticulous detail, covered in his father's familiar script and geological symbols. It depicted a section of the very territory they were in, not far from his own ranch. In the center of the map, one area was circled in red ink, with a single word written beside it. Argentum. Argentum. Eleonora breathed, leaning closer. Latin for silver. Caleb stared at the map. It all made sense now. Her father, the geologist, must have discovered a significant silver deposit. Croft, his partner, knew about it. He had manufactured Eleanor's debts and her fake marriage to get her out of Boston, away from her father's papers, so he could claim the find for himself. But he hadn't found the map. He had assumed she had it, unknowingly, among her father's possessions. And he had been right. "This is what he's after," Caleb said, his voice grim. "This is worth a fortune, and he will kill to get it." The piece of paper lying on the bed between them was no longer just a map. It was a death warrant. The danger was no longer a vague threat. It was specific, tangible, and far greater than he had imagined. The knowledge of the map intensified the siege-like atmosphere at the ranch. Caleb knew the two men would not give up. They would report back to whoever hired them, and they would return, likely with reinforcements. He spent the next day fortifying the ranch, checking the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace, ensuring he had enough ammunition. He instructed Martha to keep the shutters closed after dark. He was preparing for a war. He decided the men would most likely try an ambush on the road. It was the easiest way to isolate a target. To test his theory and to lay a trap of his own, he told Eleanor and Martha that he needed to ride out to check on a remote section of his herd, a journey that would take him several hours. He told them to stay inside and keep the doors barred until his return. Eleonora watched him saddle Atlas, her heart pounding with a cold dread. "Please be careful, Caleb," she said, her hand resting on his arm. The simple touch was grounding, a point of warmth in a world that had turned cold and dangerous. He looked down at her hand, then into her worried eyes. "I will be," he said, his voice softer than usual. He wanted to say more, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply squeezed her hand briefly before mounting his horse and riding out. But he did not ride toward the high pastures. He circled around, taking a less traveled path through a rocky canyon that gave him a concealed vantage point overlooking the main road to his ranch. He dismounted, tethered Atlas in a thicket of juniper, and settled down behind a large boulder with his rifle, his eyes scanning the road. He was a patient man. The land had taught him that. He could wait. Hours passed. The sun beat down, and the rocks around him radiated heat. Finally, late in the afternoon, he saw them. The two men from town, riding slowly, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They were not heading for the ranch house. They were taking up positions in a narrow pass a mile from his property, a perfect spot for an ambush. They clearly believed he was still out on the range and were planning to intercept him on his return. Caleb watched them, his mind cold and clear. He had the advantage of surprise. He could pick them off from his current position. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But a cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. What if this was a diversion? What if there were more men, and their real target was the ranch and Eleonora? The thought sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He could not risk it. He had to get back to the house. He slipped back to his horse, moving with a silent, practiced ease. He kept to the low ground, pushing Atlas at a hard pace, his heart pounding in time with the horse's hooves. As he crested the final rise before his property, his worst fears were realized. There were two other horses tied to the fence post near his barn, and the front door of his house was splintered, hanging crookedly on its hinges. They had bypassed him. They had gone straight for her. A guttural roar of fury escaped his lips. He spurred Atlas into a frantic gallop, pulling the rifle from its scabbard as he rode. He didn't care about the noise he was making. He didn't care about the danger. The only thought in his mind was Eleonora. Inside the house, time had slowed to a terrifying crawl for Eleonora. She and Martha had heard the horses approach. One look through the window confirmed it was not Caleb. It was the scar man from town and another, even larger brute with him. "Get your hands off her, you filthy animal," she yelled. The second man laughed and backhanded Martha across the face, sending her sprawling to the floor. The man holding her grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The scarred man, who had been ransacking the main room, spun around, drawing his pistol. Eleonora screamed Caleb's name, a desperate warning. The man fired, the bullet whizzing past Caleb's head, close enough to feel its heat. Caleb dove for cover behind the heavy oak dining table, working the lever action of his rifle. The house had become a death trap. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and choking. Eleonora, seeing Martha stirring on the floor, scrambled to her side, pulling her behind the relative safety of an overturned settee. The scar man was using a large armchair for cover, firing blindly in Caleb's direction. Splinters of wood flew from the table. Caleb knew he was pinned down. He needed distraction. "Eleonora," he shouted over the gunfire. "The fireplace. The lamp oil." She understood immediately. While the man was focused on Caleb, she crawled on her hands and knees to the small can of lamp oil kept on the hearth. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely unscrew the cap. She poured a small amount onto a loose piece of kindling. With trembling fingers, she struck a match. It flared to life. She tossed the burning stick into the wood box next to the armchair where the gunman was hiding. The dry wood and shavings caught instantly, smoke and flames erupting with a whoosh. The man yelled in surprise and pain as the fire licked at his cover. He jumped to his feet, beating at the flames on his trousers, momentarily exposed. It was the opening Caleb needed. He rose from behind the table and fired. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered back, his pistol clattering to the floor, before collapsing in a heap. Silence descended, sudden and absolute, broken only by the crackle of the small fire and Eleonora's ragged breaths. Caleb moved cautiously from behind the table, his rifle still raised, and checked both men. They were alive, but incapacitated. He turned to Eleonora, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. She was pale and trembling. Her dress was torn, but she was unharmed. She was kneeling beside Martha, who was groaning, holding her head. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder, not quite daring to touch her, as if she were a fragile vision that might disappear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, a reaction to the terror and the relief. "No, I'm all right, Martha." He gently examined the older woman's head. There was a nasty bruise forming, but the skin was not broken. "She'll be all right." A headache for a few days, he looked back at Eleonora, and the control he had maintained throughout the fight finally broke. The image of that man's hands on her, the thought of what could have happened, washed over him in a sickening wave. He had almost lost her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his defenses. This was the consequence of attachment. This was the pain he had spent 5 years running from. He had let her into his life, and in doing so, he had put her in mortal danger. The guilt was a suffocating weight. He had to get her away from this, away from him. It was the only way to keep her safe. His heart, which had just begun to open, slammed shut with a desolate finality. He stood up, his face becoming a cold, unreadable mask. "It's over," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. "But they'll send more men. You're not safe here. You can't stay." Eleonora looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion and hurt. He had just saved her life, had looked at her with an emotion so raw and powerful it had taken her breath away. And now he was shutting her out, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have to leave," he stated, his tone flat and brutal. He refused to look at her, focusing instead on the mess in the room, the bodies on the floor, the evidence of the violence she had brought into his quiet world. "I'll take you to Cheyenne myself. I'll buy you a ticket back to Boston. You have the map. You'll be wealthy. You can start a new life, a safe life, away from all of this, away from me," his mind screamed. Each word was a dagger in her heart. She rose to her feet, her own shock and fear giving way to a rising tide of anger and pain. "A safe life? You think it's what I want? To run back to a world where I have nothing and no one?" You want to send me away after everything that has happened. It's for your own good, he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. He was trying to protect her, but it felt like a betrayal. He was pushing her away because the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. He was a coward, retreating to his fortress of solitude because it was the only thing he knew. Is it? She challenged, her voice trembling with emotion. Or is it for yours? Are you sending me away because you're afraid? You talk of my safety, but you're the one who is hiding, Caleb. You've built walls around your heart so high that you can't see anything over them. You hide in your grief because it's easier than letting someone in, easier than risking being hurt again. Her words struck him with the force of truth, laying his deepest fears bare. He flinched as if she had physically struck him. He had no defense against her accusations because they were true. He was a coward. You don't know anything about me, he growled, his voice low and dangerous, a last, desperate attempt to push her away. I know that you are a good and honorable man who is determined to live a miserable, lonely life because you are terrified of being happy, she shot back, tears of frustration streaming down her cheeks. I thought we had found something here. A connection. Was I wrong? Was it all in my head? He couldn't answer. He couldn't tell her that she was right, that the connection between them was the most real thing he had felt in years, and that it terrified him to his very soul. To admit it would be to surrender, to let her see the gaping wound in his heart that he had tried so hard to hide. So he remained silent, his jaw clenched, his expression a mask of stone. Her face crumpled in pain at his silence. It was the answer she had dreaded. I see, she whispered, her voice breaking. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection against the coldness emanating from him. Fine. If that is what you wish, Mr. Thorne, I will pack my things. She turned and walked, with as much dignity as she could muster, toward her room, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his home and the ruins of the future he had almost dared to imagine. He had done it. He had pushed her away. He had saved her. And in doing so, he had condemned himself to a loneliness more profound and absolute than any he had ever known before. The silence that descended was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. While Sheriff Brody and his men hauled away the wounded thugs and began the process of sending telegraphs that would eventually unravel Silas Croft's entire enterprise, an oppressive quiet settled over the Thorne Ranch. Martha, her head bandaged, worked silently to clean up the debris, her disapproving glances at Caleb sharper than any words. Eleonora remained in her room, the sound of her movements small and final as she packed her few belongings back into the worn leather valise. Caleb felt like a ghost in his own home. He nailed a board over the broken door, his movements mechanical, his mind a maelstrom of regret. Every nail he hammered felt like another seal on his fate. He had won the battle, but lost the war. He had protected her body, but had crushed her spirit, and his own along with it. Her words echoed in his head. You are terrified of being happy. The truth of it was a bitter pill. He had mistaken solitude for strength for so long that he no longer knew the difference. He had thought he was protecting her, but he was only protecting himself from the possibility of more pain. Late that night, unable to sleep, he found himself on the porch, staring out at the moon-drenched landscape. The world was vast and beautiful, but for the first time in years, its emptiness offered him no comfort. It only mirrored the hollow ache in his chest. He heard the faint creak of the floorboards behind him and knew it was her. He didn't turn around. I will be ready to leave at first light, she said, her voice strained and formal. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim lamplight from the house. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. This was his last chance. One word from him could change everything. He could tell her the truth. He could tell her that her accusations were right, that he was a fool and a coward. He could tell her that the thought of her leaving felt like a part of him was being torn away. But the habits of 5 years were a powerful prison. The words died before they could be spoken. Caleb, she said, and the sound of his given name, spoken so softly, was his undoing. I want you to know something before I go. I am not Sarah. I could never replace her or your daughter. I would never try, but I had hoped. I had hoped that perhaps I could help you build something new. I was wrong to hope. She turned to go back inside, and the finality of that movement shattered the walls he had built around his heart. The fear of losing her, truly, finally losing her, was suddenly 1,000 times more terrifying than the fear of the pain that loving her might bring. He couldn't let her walk away. He couldn't go back to the silence. Not now. Not after he had heard music again. Wait, he said, his voice cracking. He stood and turned to face her. In the pale moonlight, he could see the glint of tears on her cheeks. Don't go. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire world. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch hesitant, reverent. Everything you said, you were right, he confessed, his voice thick with unshed emotion. I'm a coward. I've been hiding for so long, I forgot how to live. The day you arrived, it was like the sun coming out after a long winter. You brought light and warmth into this empty house, into my empty life. And it scared me more than any gunman ever could. He looked into her eyes, letting her see past the stoic rancher, letting her see the broken man beneath. I tried to send you away because the thought of anything happening to you, of losing you, it would be like losing them all over again. And I don't think I could survive that. But I was wrong. I see that now. Living without you, sending you away when you're standing right here. That is what I cannot survive. That isn't a life at all. Tears welled in Eleonora's eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. A fragile, trembling hope dawned on her face. Caleb, she whispered. I love you, Eleonora, he said, the words a torrent, a confession that had been dammed up for too long. I love your strength, and your courage, and the way you see the world. You made me feel again. Please don't leave me alone in the dark. She let out a small sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and surged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck. He caught her, pulling her tight against him, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and Eleonora that was now the scent of home. He held her as if he would never let her go, and in the quiet of the Wyoming night, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, the solitary man finally surrendered his fortress. He had faced down gunmen and grief, but in the end, it was the quiet courage of a woman from Boston who had finally brought him to his knees and, in doing so, had saved him from himself. In a quiet aftermath, with the threat of Silas Croft neutralized and his hired guns in custody, a new dawn broke over the Thorn Ranch, both literally and figuratively. The air itself felt lighter, cleansed of the tension and fear that had gripped it. Caleb, having finally confessed his heart, felt as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He moved with a purpose and a lightness that Martha had not seen in him for half a decade. The morning after his declaration, he found Eleonora on the porch, watching the sunrise. He came and stood beside her, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that felt both new and entirely natural. They watched in comfortable silence as the sun crested the mountains, spilling gold, and rose across the vast expanse of the plains. I meant every word I said last night, he said quietly, turning to face her. I know, she replied, her smile radiant. I did not doubt you for a moment. He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat, his calloused fingers fumbling for a moment before they withdrew a small, simple object. It was a gold ring, worn smooth with time, with a single, tiny seed pearl set in its center. It was not a grand or flashy piece of jewelry, but it shone with the soft, warm light of history and devotion. This was my mother's, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She gave it to me before she passed, told me to give it to the woman I couldn't imagine a single day without. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he looked into her eyes. Eleonora Ainsworth, I cannot imagine another sunrise without you by my side. Will you marry me? Will you build a new life with me here? Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the ring to his earnest, hopeful face. Her journey to the West had begun with the promise of a sham marriage, a loveless arrangement born of deceit. Now, she was being offered a true partnership, a future forged in courage, respect, and a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Oh, Caleb, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He sealed his proposal with a kiss, a tender, reverent promise of all the sunrises yet to come. From the kitchen window, Martha watched them, a wide, satisfied smile on her face as she wiped a tear away with the corner of her apron. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption Gulch like a welcome summer rain. The town, which had first seen Eleonora as a mysterious outsider and Caleb as a reclusive, tragic figure, now embraced them as their own. Sheriff Brody slapped Caleb on the back with a force that nearly sent him stumbling, his gruff congratulations barely hiding his deep affection. The women of the town, led by the storekeeper's wife, descended upon the ranch with offers of help for the wedding, bringing with them pies, fabrics, and a torrent of cheerful chatter that filled the once silent house with life. They were married a month later, not in a church, but on the porch of the ranch house, overlooking the land that was now their shared home. Eleonora wore a simple cream-colored dress that the town seamstress had helped her fashion from her old traveling clothes, a symbol of her transformation from a stranded Easterner to a woman of the West. Caleb stood tall and proud in his best suit, the shadows of the past finally chased from his eyes, replaced by the bright, steady light of his love for the woman beside him. The entire town of Redemption Gulch was in attendance, their presence a testament to the community that had rallied around them, accepting their union and celebrating their new beginning. 2 years later, the warm light of a late summer evening settled over the ranch, softening the rugged lines of the landscape. The house had grown, a new wing extending from its side, a sign of the prosperity and life that now filled it. The splintered front door had long been replaced, and the porch swing Caleb had built now moved in a gentle, rhythmic creak. The silence that reigned was no longer one of emptiness, but of deep, abiding peace. Eleonora sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. Her gaze was fixed on the small boy toddling on unsteady legs in the grass nearby. He had Caleb's dark, unruly hair and her own sky-blue eyes. At 2 years old, little Samuel was a whirlwind of joyous energy, a living embodiment of their love. Eleonora's free hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their second child was growing, a quiet promise of the future. She smiled as Sam stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, letting out a surprised giggle rather than a cry. He was a child of this land, sturdy and resilient. She thought back to the woman she had been, the one who had stepped off the train in a cloud of dust and despair. That woman seemed like a stranger to her now. The West had not been the end of the world as she had feared, but the beginning of her true one. It had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately, it had empowered her. She had found not just a home, but herself. Caleb came up the porch steps, his boots making a soft, familiar sound on the wood. He was returning from the barn, the scent of hay and horse clinging to him. He paused behind her chair, his large, warm hands coming to rest on her shoulders, his thumbs gently stroking her collarbone. He followed her gaze to their son, and a look of profound contentment settled on his face. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her hair. "He has your laugh," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. "And he has your stubbornness," she countered, leaning her head back against his chest. "He tried to climb the corral fence 3 times today." Caleb chuckled, a deep, easy sound that she loved. He looked around him, at the thriving ranch, at the warm light spilling from the windows of their home, at his son playing in the yard, at his beautiful wife, her body carrying their future. He remembered the fortress of silence he had once inhabited, the gray, colorless world of his grief. Eleonora had not just broken down his walls. She had leveled them and planted a garden in their place, a garden filled with light, laughter, and a love so deep it had become the very foundation of his existence. He had once believed that attachments were a weakness, a sure path to ruin. Now he knew they were the only thing that gave life meaning, the only true source of strength. You are my home, Eleanor, he said softly, the words a simple, heartfelt truth. She turned her head, her hand coming up to cover his on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her love for him shining in her eyes, as vast and clear as the Wyoming sky above them. And you, she whispered, are mine.